What's up, guys? This is TheKephas. Welcome back, everybody, to WoW Leveling Wednesdays. We are still here in Silverpine Forest leveling up our enhancement shaman, and boy, do I have a hopefully fun topic to share with you guys today, and I hope that I can sort of bounce my thoughts off of you guys listening, and maybe you can give me some feedback or at least some thoughts of your own about this subject in the comments below, because it's something that I've been thinking about for a while and I've grown very passionate about it. And it all started with, I guess, an acceptance speech by Phil Spencer about a month ago, maybe even a little bit less than that. But either way, he said in his speech that, game companies need to stop dividing gamers from game creators. And that's what he said, and I liked hearing him say that because I agree wholeheartedly with that statement. And I think that if you've been a gamer for a while, you have seen that growing divide take place, and I actually think that it's existed for a lot longer than people realize. But it's really just that we've been growing more and more, I guess, close as a world, and our ability to communicate has expanded, and it has grown significantly, exponentially, in the past, decade or so, even a little bit longer than that, I guess. But, and I think that's a big part of why it may seem like it's an issue that's grown. But honestly, as someone who's been a gamer for a very long time, I feel like this is something that has been around since I've been a gamer, really. And I guess I wanted to sort of talk about it because, to my knowledge, I don't know if this is something that's been documented. And I guess I'm going to give my, read on the situation from a biased standpoint, because I'm a gamer. I'm not a game creator. So obviously I'm going to sort of, take the position as a gamer when I give my thoughts on this. But when it comes to the divide between gamers and game creators, it's something that has been around, I think, like I said, from the very beginning, going back to the days of the arcade, right? Like, as far as I know, that was sort of the beginning of, like, gaming becoming this thing that was accessible to the general population. It was especially in arcades at first. And when you look at arcades, there are a lot of great early arcade games. As early as I can remember. When I think of, like, early arcade games, I think of games like Space Invaders, Donkey Kong, Pac-Man, Pong, those sorts of games. And those were kind of before my time, I think. But, eventually that expanded into games like, the beat-em-up games like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and that awesome Simpsons beat-em-up game, and of course, eventually you had games like Mortal Kombat and so many other fun games, like games with guns, like where you use guns, like, House of the Dead, and those really awesome Police Academy games. I don't know if anybody ever played those. Those were always fun. There were tons of awesome, arcade games, and there still are. If you go to places like, I don't know, Scene 75, Dave and Buster's, I don't know what sorts of arcades still exist where you live, but they still exist, and there are still some pretty fun games to play, but honestly, like, when you look at arcade games, there is a negative side. And when I think of it, I think of, if you've ever seen Wayne's World, the original Wayne's World that came out like early 1990s. And, one of the villains in that movie was Noah, who owned an arcade. It was called Noah's Arcade. And there's a scene where he talks about his latest game, which is called like Xantar or something. And basically, he explains how the game is impossible to beat. And so people keep, pumping out quarters trying to beat the game, and it's impossible. So the game is rigged. It's rigged against the gamer in order to entice the gamer to give more money. And that was a pretty good finger on the pulse of what arcade games were all about. And I think that, a lot of people back in the day, I think that, like, gaming was new, it was fresh, it was exciting, but, people did start to realize, I remember as a kid, I had friends who were pump quarters in games. 20, 30, 40 bucks worth into arcade games trying to get their name on the scoreboard. And I wasn't like that. I was like, I'll give it a couple bucks If I really like it, maybe I'll play for a little bit, but I'm not going to sit here and pump out a bunch of money. I would be more inclined to pump out a bunch of money in like the pool table, or maybe like the air hockey table, where it was just a game, like a fun little game between you and your friend, and you kind of knew what you were getting into. Those were fun. But like trying to pump out a bunch of quarters to beat like, I don't know, to beat like those beat 'em ups that were like really hard and would take a long time and a lot of money, I wasn't really into it. And so right off the bat, you have this awesome technology that comes out, and immediately it's got this carny, thing behind it, like these carny tactics that are designed to sort of, trick the customer base into pumping out as much money as possible. And I suppose you can't really fault them for wanting to make money from it, but I guess it's the nefarious nature of how those, systems, the arcades would make their money. And then you get into console gaming, and we're just now getting into the Atari, right? Which I believe, there was like, the Intellivision, a lot of consoles that I never even experienced. But I think of the Atari 2600. I actually have one to this day in my closet. And I remember, that came out again before I was born, but I still had access to one. And I don't really remember a single good game on it, really. Maybe there was like a fun basketball game I played. Maybe there was a game on there, a couple games that were okay. But I remember even Pac-Man sucked on the Atari. How do you make Pac-Man bad? Well, the Atari managed to do it. And it got so bad with all these games, these shovelware games, and these licensed games, that you just knew that the people making them had to know they were bad, right? They had to know. And it got bad to the point where it killed the Atari, and it almost killed the entire industry before it really got going. And it was like looking like it was going to be this fad thing, right? And like there's the legends, and I don't even think it's a legend, I think it's real. There's like a bunch of Atari cartridges buried in the desert somewhere. Weird stuff, right? Because again, it's people trying to make a quick buck off of people chasing this fad, and not really trying to create quality. Though I'm sure there were plenty of people making Atari games that were genuinely trying to create quality, and there probably were some, like a handful of decent games on that console. But for the most part, it was pretty bad. Until some guy comes along and comes up with an idea about a plumber saving a princess from a turtle dragon dude, and then, it saves the console industry, right? And that's kind of like the story. That's how I know the story, and so then the Nintendo takes off, right? So again, you've got two instances of the gaming industry with the arcade and the carny tactics, and then the console industry with the, cash-ins, right? And so already, right off the bat, you have this sort of thing happening where people creating and publishing these products clearly are not trying to create a positive reputation, or build a solid foundation of trust between their customer base, and the work that they're doing, right? And so right off the bat, you're setting up an industry designed to, in a lot of instances, and generally speaking, to sort of screw over the customer base, right? And that's how it started. So then you have the Nintendo, and, there are a lot of great games on Nintendo. Mario 2 even, Mario 3, Legend of Zelda 2, Star Tropics, Punch-Out, the Tecmo Super Bowl game. There's so many fun games. Contra. There's still, to this day, fun games on the Nintendo. They're still fun. All the Mega Man games, the Ninja Turtle, arcade games that got, ported over, which weren't as good as the arcade, but still they're pretty fun, and you had a lot of games like that. Some that were really good, some, though, that weren't as good. And so, like, even though the Atari was known for the shovelware, there was a lot of shovelware on Nintendo as well. It's just that Nintendo had a lot more good games, and even some of the mediocre ones were still kind of fun to play. And I remember, like, I would get games for pretty cheap back in those days. I remember having a big box full of games because, like, games would come out and the good ones would stay good, and, you'd get those. But then there would be a lot of crappy ones that you could get for a lot cheaper, and I remember having tons of them. A lot of them that I would play sometimes and quickly realize that they sucked. And, when I was a little kid, I didn't know any better. But as I got older, I realized what the good games were and what the bad games were. And I was starting to sort of formulate an opinion, or at least a somewhat understanding of what the difference was. But back in those days, you didn't have the internet. You didn't have a large pool of people to get information from to know what a good game was and what a bad game was, right? And so eventually you could rent games because you didn't know if you want to pay full price for a game, or you couldn't just keep buying games. People didn't have the money to just keep buying brand new games, and certainly you don't know what's good. And so you create this sort of mentality in your customer base where you really don't know what you're getting from a game because you've been burned so many times, and sometimes there's enough good out there that you want to keep finding new games. There's enough diamonds in the rough that you want to keep searching. But you're also getting burnt a lot by bad games. And so you start renting them from Blockbuster or Take-Two or wherever, like Hollywood Video, I forget, like other rental places back in the day. And I remember every weekend I go to my grandparents and my grandpa would rent me a couple games. And there were a lot of weekends where I was bummed because the game I rented was terrible. And I felt like I was getting screwed over, and it was frustrating as a kid not knowing what was good and what was bad, because you see a game about a TV show that you like a Batman game, which actually the Nintendo Batman games are pretty fun, but you know what I mean, like you see some licensed game or some other game that you're excited, ooh, they made a game for the Ninja Turtles, and honestly, as much as people remember that first Ninja Turtles games, it kind of sucks, and I remember playing it and just never finishing it. You get kind of let down. And that kind of extends into the Sega, the Super Nintendo, all the way, through multiple console generations. That was kind of how things were. You had good games, you had bad games, and you really, truly never knew what you were getting. And sometimes, a company, would make, like, you would have companies that would have some good reputations. Back in the day, believe it or not, Konami was one that, they had some good games, and some IPs that you could trust, right? Like, there were some that you could trust from Konami, and Nintendo especially, Mario, Zelda, you knew those were going to be good, and they almost always were, and a lot of other games that come out. I mean, there's so many, the Final Fantasy games that got better and better, the Metal Gear series, and, we're kind of skipping ahead here, but you get the idea. So, there were some companies that built up a good reputation. But generally speaking, though, it's a mixed bag, and you kind of have to wade through the garbage to find the good stuff. And so again, there's this level of mistrust. You can't fully trust any game until you play it. Right? So fortunately, we're finally getting into an era where gaming is growing and there's a lot more communication. You have like Game Informer magazine reviewing games, and that kind of helps out a little bit. More of your friends are playing games, and it's becoming more of a common thing in the world, and people are playing games, and you find out about good games because other people are playing them, and someone might say, oh, don't play that game, it's pretty bad, or sometimes a friend will tell you about some obscure game that's really good, and you'll check that out. Like I remember my friend, introduced me to Legend of Dragoon when I was like in middle school, and I love that game. It's a game that's somewhat well known, but it's also somewhat kind of obscure. So you had that, and eventually the internet does come out. We're getting into kind of like the PS2, GameCube era, right? Early Xbox era, and now you have the internet, and now gaming is becoming more of a thing, and you're seeing it on TV more, and more people are getting into it, and now you can go online and you can go to some websites and you can look up information about games. Is this game any good? And boy, was that helpful, because now you have people, you have a way to curate the process of finding good games, and it kind of saves you some money, right? So that kind of helps out as well. So that's how gaming was for a long time, for many years. I mean, for the first roughly, I would say 20 years of gaming, that's how gaming was, really. You had to sort of dig in and find out what the good games were. Sometimes even games you trusted, you still kind of wanted to know what you were getting, because you just wanted to make sure that you weren't wasting your money. Because like if you're not somewhat well off in life, and even if you are like living a somewhat comfortable life, it's still a big ask to pay $60 for a game and have that not be good, right? Like in my world growing up, that was, I would get games I wanted, but it was always bad if I would get one and it wasn't very good. So that was kind of the thing about it. And there were a lot of times where you would be frustrated. Man, like I paid this money for this game that clearly isn't very good, And I don't just mean like opinion related not good, like you can take a look at like the Sonic Adventure games from the Dreamcast back in the day, and there are people that say those games suck, and there are people that think they're the best games ever, and then there are people like me, they're like, yeah, they're not perfect, but they were still fun. I'm not even talking about games like that. I'm talking about games that like genuinely, these games are terrible, right? Like knockoff games, licensed games, eventually, you just don't even bother with those, or just some other games that you think look cool and they're just not. You get the idea. If you've been around gaming, you know what I'm talking about. So you have the arcade era, right? The early console era, and then the console boom era. And in all these eras, there is still this level of mistrust that is just sort of ingrained in the process of finding new games, right? And you get burnt and you get frustrated and you have a level of mistrust towards the people making the games, and you don't know anything about game design or how these companies are ran, and you don't care. Why is it your responsibility to care about any of that stuff? You're just a customer looking for something fun to do, and you're looking for a good game to play. Why should you be expected to know anything beyond that, right? I mean, that's just kind of the way it is. And so that's the early days. That's kind of like the first half, I guess, of gaming. You could say roughly the first half of gaming. That's how it is. And then something changed. We're not even getting into the worst part, right? Eventually, something changed. And I guess some people might say it's overblown, it's over-mentioned, we've heard it 1,000 times before. I'm not going to bury the lead any further. Horse armor. Elder Scrolls Oblivion Horse Armor. Oblivion is an incredible game. It was such a good game, still is a good game, but it brought something into the industry that was sort of new. And it was this idea that you could be asked to pay for something in the game beyond just paying for the game itself. And boy, did that not get received very well, right? That was a bad thing that came out. It didn't stop it from coming out, though. And despite the resistance that it got, I suppose it must have been successful enough because it kept happening. And more companies were looking to, I guess, expand their profit in games. And so now, hey, we can sell games, and then we can add extra content to those games and ask people to pay a premium for that content. That's called DLC or microtransactions, depending on the type of content, right? And so now you have this new thing where it's not just buying the game, right? Now you have to buy DLC to get the full game, or get extra content for the game. And there's this thing now where, you can't just buy the game and put your credit card down. You have to keep your credit card handy because you might be asked to buy something extra for the game that maybe is enticing, right? And so now we're kind of getting back into the feeling of the arcades where, there's just always more money that's going to have to be spent if you want to keep playing this game, kind of thing. And I guess like one of the defenses I've heard for this change is that, the gaming industry never really adjusted for inflation. I've heard that from people, and I guess it's somewhat true, though I think that, video games back in the day were like, maybe they were $40 or $50, and it got bumped to $60, and it's been $60 for a very long time, and now it's kind of getting into $70 for the base standard edition, right? And, you kind of understand where they're coming from with that, but then again, at the same time, you look at other, media, industries, and it's kind of the same, but it's also like, you have to realize that gaming as a market has exploded. It has grown exponentially, and I think that's a big part of why there hasn't really been a need to adjust for inflation, because the market's exploded, and if you try to adjust those prices too much, that's going to kill the growth. And the growth was the important thing, because now the more people getting into the industry and getting into gaming, the more people you have to sell games to, and therefore you're going to make more money that way, and eventually you're going to have a solid customer base. That's the most important thing, is growing your customer base, and you're going to get a profit that way. So that's why there really wasn't a need to expand, or I guess adjust for the inflation and whatnot. And that's just my basic level of understanding of how economics work. But still, gamers are only going to shell out so much money for video games, so you have to be careful with that. So the idea now is like, well, we're growing, and maybe we're kind of plateauing, so we need to double dip into our market, and so we're going to sell the game, and then we're going to sell extra content for the game. And you know what? To be fair, sometimes that was fine. Sometimes you would get a game come out that was a full game, and then it would release DLC, and that DLC just added more to the game. A good example I can think of would be The Witcher, right? And I guess like The Witcher 3, right, is what I mean. And I guess you can even go back and I guess it wasn't fully new with the horse armor, because I remember Diablo 2 came out like many years before, and it had an expansion pass, right? So that's kind of like that's DLC. That's essentially what that is. The Sims had that too. I mean, of course, The Sims is a little bit crazy how expensive that would get, but still, you get the idea. So it wasn't entirely new with horse armor. I guess that's just kind of the big, it's like this small purchase. It's more microtransactions with that, but it also did kind of suddenly every game is getting this DLC now, right? So it kind of brought more of that into the gaming industry as a whole, both microtransactions and DLC. So it wasn't entirely new at that point, but I guess that's just kind of the moment that collectively people think back to, that sort of really expanded on that, and it started to kind of go downhill from there, I guess. So to clarify, but still, you had times where DLC felt great. Diablo 2 Lord of Destruction is another great example of that. And even sometimes The Sims would feel like a good full game, but then you would get DLC, and it was like, oh, okay, this some of it's cool and some of it's not so much, and then they would make the next Sims game, and suddenly you felt like you were getting screwed over. So that's a good example of where DLC gets out of hand, though the fans of The Sims seem to not mind so much. So to each their own. But so you do have games that come out that don't feel finished, that don't feel complete, and it feels like you almost have to buy the DLC to get the full experience, right? And so that's a problem. And so now you have that going on, where there's this mistrust with the gaming industry in terms of the idea that now you're paying more for less, and that feels like a problem. And that's only after all these years of mistrust that's already been sown. And so now you've got that going on, and here I am trying to work all this out, because it's starting to get a lot more complicated. And so and so I'll tell you when it really hit hard for me. It was a long time after the horse armor, but I remember when Mortal Kombat 10 was coming out, and I remember getting on Steam one day, and I get an ad pop up for Mortal Kombat 10, pre-order the game, and you'd unlock Goro. And that really hit me hard. And the reason why, sorry, pop-up. We're fine. The reason why that bothered me is because my mind went back to my childhood when Mortal Kombat 3 comes out. And, there are these secret characters that you had to find out about. And people were going crazy talking amongst your friends about it. And how do you unlock them? How do you unlock Smoke? And how do you unlock Jade? And how do you unlock Reptile or whatever? That was a big thing back in those days in Mortal Kombat. There were always hidden characters that you would unlock. And now in Mortal Kombat 10, how do you unlock them? You pay for them. It's not a secret anymore. It's not a fun thing that you do in the game. It's just an extra credit card swipe that you have to do it. And that's kind of the thing with with some DLC, but even more with microtransactions, is that stuff used to be in the games, and it would be locked behind fun things that you would do in the games to unlock cosmetics and other features in the game, I suppose, or characters or whatever it is. And nowadays those things aren't unlocks anymore; they're extra purchases, and that's why I resist people that defend those microtransactions, because in my mind, you are defending or willingly giving up a more full gaming experience to pay more money. And to me, I don't see the logic to that as a customer to ever like just okay, yeah. And I guess some people can say, well, it's just the way things are going, so I'm just going with the flow of things. And it's like, well, customers and gamers can have a say in that by resisting it, and I guess people just won't. So you can't, that's just kind of what it is. But still, it still leaves a bad taste in your mouth. And that's kind of the thing with a lot of microtransactions, especially for games that you pay for. We're not even getting in the freemium games and the live service games, and that's a whole new avenue of cluster. With the mistrust and the way things go with gamers, and in those types of games, there's a lot to talk about there. But just sticking with like DLC and stuff like that, it's kind of just it just adds to it, this growing mistrust and this growing resentment that gamers have, who are just, first off, I need to find a good game, and second off, I need to find a game that's not trying to just screw me over financially, and to sort of highlight another example of how in-game shops, DLC, extra content can mess with a game. I remember when Assassin's Creed Origins came out, and honestly, Assassin's Creed Syndicate started it, but Origins is where it really kind of got me thinking. So when Assassin's Creed Origins came out, it was a big change for the Assassin's Creed games, and it actually was received very well at the time. Believe it or not, now it's like there's this weird revisionist history about the new Assassin's Creed games. But here's the thing. So Assassin's Creed Origins comes out. It's about 25 hours to beat, right? It's about a 25-hour game, and it has an in-game shop. And in that in-game shop, you can buy XP boosts, permanent XP boost, and you can buy permanent increase to materials that you gather when you play the game, okay? And when I saw that, I was like, this is a good game, but that being in the game sort of entices Ubisoft to design the game to be artificially slowed down to entice you to buy those boosts so that then you feel like you're going at a good pace, right? And that wasn't so much the case in Origins because it was a relatively shorter game. 25 hours for an open world Assassin's Creed game. Okay. Well, then Assassin's Creed Odyssey comes out, and that game is like 50 hours to beat. So sure enough, they double the time. And sure, that's one of the things people are like, man, this game's kind of long, it's kind of crazy, And so then Assassin's Creed Valhalla comes out. That game's like 90 hours to beat, right? And so you go from a game 25 hours, then 50 hours, and then 90 hours, and you have people like, well, isn't that good? Because that's you're really getting your money's worth with all that time investment, and then you play it. It's like it's that long because you have to grind levels or buy the boost to kind of speed it up, right? It's very grindy without the boost, and it doesn't feel as good to play without, essentially having that boost. And then the pace feels somewhat better. Sure enough, it was easy to see where they were going with that, and that's exactly what happened, and now look at where Ubisoft is. So, those are the, when you think about stuff like that and those boosts and, there's incentive. And if you think that's conspiracy theorists, go back to the arcade days. That's the thing, is like people say you need to get with the times and you need to see where gaming is going. It's like, dude, it's where gaming's been. It's always been like this. Gaming has always been like this. It's always been an industry of people just looking for ways to trick the customer base into giving up more money. That's how it's always been. And if you want to know why there's a gap, why there's a divide between gamers and creators, that's it. That is the reason for it. Because gamers, who love video games and have experienced great games and want to find more, have had to put up with these tactics for 30 plus years. I'm in my mid 30s and I've been playing games since I was like 4 years old. So for me, it's been forever. I've always seen this stuff. It's always been this way in the gaming industry. And so you want to know why there's a divide. And so now, after all these years, game companies need to stop, dividing gamers from creators. And you're just kind of sitting there like, yeah, sure do. Where was this 30 years ago? Right? And you know, and to be fair, all due respect to Phil Spencer, Xbox has a big hand in this as much as every other company has. Sony, Xbox, even Nintendo, Square Enix, Ubisoft, Activision, EA, especially those two. You know, don't even get me started. But Capcom, Konami, you know, the list goes on. They've all been guilty of it at one time or another. And hey, I get it. You want to make money. You want to be profitable. And, you know, of course, there you have a problem with companies that, you know, this is the way the sort of, I guess, the corporate world works, where it's not about sustaining, you know, your income. It's not about steady growth. It's about exponential growth every single year. And if you're not achieving those goals, then your company's basically dying, and it's going to, you know, plummet. Your shares are going to plummet. And so there's this like constant desperation to grow in such a way that it's just not sustainable, right? That's a big problem. And that's why, for example, that's why this live service bubble is popping. You have a bunch of companies flooding the market with their battle passes and free-to-play games that people just can't keep up with. You buy a battle pass and then you suddenly feel obligated to play this game. Well, you can't buy 10 battle passes, and there's only so much money that's going to go around, and so eventually you get tired of it. And I think that's where people are getting. It's like this isn't better. This is not a better experience for anybody. I'm getting less. Sure, it's free, you know, but you know, I would rather pay for a game, personally. You know, and so I think that's the problem, is that, you know, you have all of these tactics and all of this stuff that is compounded for so many years. What do you expect from people? Why do you think gamers are so jaded, and why do you think people are so frustrated, and why is there a divide, and why is there mistrust, and why is there constant, and hey, look, I'm not going to always like defend everything that gamers do. The gaming community as a whole, I mean, to be fair, there are a lot more gamers than there are game makers and creators, but still, not everything that gamers do is ideal. There's a lot of issues in the gaming, you know, community, and we've often, well, I hesitate to say we, because I'm more of an individualist type person, but as a whole, you know, gamers have often not behaved at their best, to say the least, and sometimes behaved at the absolute worst. You know, gamers have a pretty bad reputation, and sometimes it's deserved, though again, it's a pretty large group of people, so it may not be entirely fair to paint everybody with that brush. You know, so it's a little bit easier to sort of look at the industry and say, well, it kind of starts with you guys, because you're the ones that put all this stuff out there and create this tension and create this hostility and create this mistrust, and you know, and then you have situations like, dare I even bring it up, like you have situations like Gamergate, right? And you know, we don't like to talk about that very much because of how nasty that got. And again, gamers far from their best, at least some of them, right? And you have horrible things being said, things that are indefensible. But at the same time, you know, it doesn't excuse what the original sort of point of Gamergate was about, which was this mistrust. And suddenly, you know, gaming journalists who you were supposed to be able to trust to provide you with information about whether or not a game is good so you can make an informed purchase, now there's suddenly a mistrust with that industry. When a game journalist is fired for giving an honest critique of a game, because the company behind, you know, well, in this case, we're talking about the Kane and Lynch situation. Let's just be open about it, I guess. You know, that whole situation. Kane and Lynch firing, I forget his name, but that journalist for being honest about how bad the game was. Well, that creates a level of mistrust, right? And then you have the instances of where, you know, you just have journalists that are in the back pocket of the corporations that make games, and hey, we're not going to send you review copies if you give us bad reviews, and you have those situations, and suddenly, you know, there's this lack of transparency, and there's this like weird incestuous relationship between game journalists and game creators, and now there's this, you know, again, more and more mistrust that's been sown, and so gamers feel backed into a corner, and sometimes that manifests in very bad, horrible ways that, again, are not excuses, but then again, we're often using those bad actors as a sort of way to sort of pivot away from the initial criticism, which never does get dealt with. And so, again, that just allows the companies to continue holding this power and continue doing what they're doing without getting, getting these answers and getting these, facing up to these, these real accusations and these real things that are happening. It's only recently that, stuff with Blizzard has happened and all this stuff coming out about them and other companies as well, and them not dealing with it. And so you have gamers getting more and more frustrated and more angry. And, well, you can kind of understand where they're coming from. I'm not going to defend all the bad behavior and the obviously the misogynistic and phobic and all that stuff that will happen in the gaming community, and certainly the attacks and the threats. That's all inexcusable. There's nothing that the industry has ever done that justifies that. But at the same time, that doesn't take away from what the industry has done and the criticisms they deserve, and a call like Phil Spencer's to stop dividing gamers from game makers begins with game companies getting back to making good games, or at least trying. I mean, sure, sometimes the intention's there and maybe it doesn't execute very well. That certainly happens, but that's not what we're always talking about. We're talking about companies that make products that are designed to swindle and screw over and manipulate the people trying to find a good game to play, right? So I side with gamers on this one. Yeah, I don't defend the bad actors for sure, but I understand the frustration. I'm among the people that are frustrated, and it's understandable. So, but I also sort of feel for, a lot of the developers as well, because a lot of times it's not their fault that things go awry. A lot of times you'll have developers that have to be quiet and have to keep their mouth shut and keep their head down because they don't want to lose their job and they don't want to put themselves in a bad spot with the company that they work for, and they kind of know, hey, we're going to make this and it's going to suck, but it's what we're told to do. And so you have these higher ups and these, you know the deal, but you have people at higher positions that hide behind these developers, and they're the ones pulling the strings and making the decisions, but then they're the ones tucking tail and hiding when the criticism comes rolling in, right? And so that's part of the problem as well. So yes, I do believe that the vast majority of the blame belongs to the higher up executives who don't even know the first thing about the products that they're making decisions that are not in the best interest of the people making the games, and also not in the best interest of the people playing the games. It all starts with them. And this isn't going to turn into some soapbox about eating the rich and the anti-capitalism. No, that's not me. I'm not that guy. I think actually that, the system we have allows consumers and customers and, the ones buying the products a lot of control over what they buy, and therefore that's their voice. Speak out and give your opinion and buy what you like and stay away from what's not good. Quit letting them trick you. Just take personal responsibility for how you spend your money. That sort of thing. And sure, maybe it's not always perfect, but it's what we have. So this isn't one of those sorts of speeches. This is just more, I guess, the whole thought process behind all this, I guess, is that really it's understandable why. Thank you, Alexa. Okay, pardon me. Anyways, so it's understandable why people are frustrated. And so while I agree with Phil Spencer about this divide and it stopping, I 100% agree, but I think most of this falls to the game companies, and it's maybe, I don't expect this to change. I don't expect this to do anything, honestly, but I definitely think that this is accountability, and if that's what Phil Spencer's doing, I don't know if that's what he's doing or not, and I don't expect a lot of others to follow suit. I have very little hope when it comes to AAA, corporate, in the gaming industry. I have very little hope. Though Nintendo did just increase the pay for their workers when they had a profit decrease. So, cool. Good job, Nintendo. Good guy, Nintendo, on that one. That's a pretty big step all things considered. But again, the bar is pretty low in this industry in how gamers and creators are treated by people saying that we need to stop this divide, right? So, anyways, this may not have been the most articulate of, but this is just kind of me shooting from the hip. Really haven't fully worked all this out yet, and I certainly didn't write this all down and follow a prompt or anything like that, so I apologize if this got a little ranty, but that's my thoughts on this, and that's where I stand with this. And so I side with gamers. In a lot of instances, I side with creators as well. I do think that we're on the same side, and I think that we both oftentimes, and I hate to use the word victim, but it's the best thing I can think of, but we're often victims of a greedy corporate world that is just trying to make as much money for themselves as possible at our expense and at the creative expense of the industry that has so much potential still and has, frankly, despite everything I've said, has still managed to deliver some incredible experiences. And I think that's why we're all still here, right? So anyways, you guys, I hope this was something that was interesting. I hope that it was food for thought. Or at the very least, I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on this in the comments below. With that, I will see you guys on the next one. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, let me know by clicking that like button. And feel free to share it with your friends so they can enjoy it as well. And if you'd like to see more videos, you can subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to be notified as soon as new videos are posted. You can also follow me on Facebook, and if you'd like, you can support my work on Patreon. Links to all that stuff can be found in the description below. This is TheKephas. Until next time.